The wire transfer hit my brother's account on a Tuesday morning. $1,200,000. I know the exact time because I was the one who confirmed it cleared. I am a forensic accountant. I trace money for a living. I follow it when people lie about where it goes, when it disappears through shell companies and amended tax returns and handshake agreements that somehow never made it onto paper. I find it. I document it. I testify to its location in federal court with my hands folded in my lap and my voice completely level. My father called me that afternoon to tell me what he'd done. He said, and I will quote him because I wrote it down the moment I hung up, "Marcus has always needed a little more runway. You've always been able to land the plane yourself." I was 37 years old. I had been landing the plane myself since I was 19. That's what this story is about. Not the money. The arithmetic. The accounting of who paid what, over how long without a single entry in the ledger. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New. The channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that silence is not the same thing as forgiveness. If you've ever been told that being capable is the same thing as not needing anything, you're exactly in the right place. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me. I should tell you what I do because it matters to everything that follows. Forensic accounting is not the same as regular accounting. Regular accounting is architecture. You build structures orderly and forward-facing. Forensic accounting is archaeology. You dig. You sift through what people buried and what they thought stayed buried, and you reconstruct what actually happened from the sediment of numbers they left behind. Bank statements, wire confirmations, amended returns, promissory notes with signatures that, upon careful examination, don't quite match. I have sat in depositions where grown men cried because I found a $47,000 discrepancy in a petty cash account they'd been skimming for 6 years. I found it in an afternoon. They thought they'd been careful. Careful people get sloppy in ways they don't notice. That's what I've learned. My husband Daniel understood this about me. He used to say I saw the world in columns, debits and credits, inputs and outputs, things that balance and things that don't. He was a high school history teacher who saw the world in stories, in cause and effect stretching across centuries. We were, in some ways, doing the same job with different tools. We met at 24. We were married at 26. We bought a house at 29 with a down payment we saved ourselves, $68,000. Which I can tell you to the dollar because I still have the wire confirmation from our savings account dated April 14th. We didn't ask anyone for help. It didn't occur to us to. My father, Raymond, was not a cruel man. I want to be careful here. He was not the kind of father who withheld affection or threw things or said things you couldn't unsay at the dinner table. He was generous in the ways that felt good to him. He picked up dinner checks, he sent Christmas boxes overpacked with things you didn't need. He called on birthdays and sometimes just on Tuesdays because he heard a song that reminded him of you. He was also the kind of man who had one picture of my brother Marcus on his desk at work for 30 years and cycled through the others. Marcus was 4 years younger. He had my father's face and my mother's charm and an almost architectural inability to finish things. Degrees, business plans, marriages. He started a restaurant that closed in 18 months. He started a real estate investment company that existed, as far as I could tell, primarily as a business card and a set of ambitious projections. He borrowed money with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never watched money run out. My father always came through. A bridge loan here. A refinance there. A don't worry about paying it back. Just get on your feet. I never asked my father for money. It did not occur to me that this was a data point he was collecting about me. I thought I was being responsible. I thought I was being the kind of daughter he could be proud of. It turns out, simply being the kind of daughter it was easy not to think about. The Tuesday it happened was March 7th. Marcus had called 2 weeks before to tell our father he'd found a commercial real estate opportunity, a mixed-use development outside of Scottsdale that he was positioned to anchor if he could move quickly. He needed capital. He needed it fast. He had a presentation. He had projections. I know all of this because my father called me that Sunday and read me Marcus's pitch notes over the phone, wanting what he called my professional opinion. I told him carefully that mixed-use commercial development carries significant exposure in the current rate environment, and that the projections Marcus had shared assumed occupancy rates that were aggressive for that particular submarket. I told him I would be happy to review the full financial package if he wanted to send it over. He said, "You always overthink these things. Marcus has a good instinct for people." I said, "Commercial real estate doesn't care about instinct." He laughed. He changed the subject to Daniel's garden, which was coming in early that year because of an unusually warm February. We talked for 20 minutes. I told him I loved him. He said he loved me too. 8 days later, on March 7th, the wire hit Marcus's account at 10:47 in the morning. I know the time because I was on a call with the client when my phone lit up with a text from Marcus that said, "Dad came through. Party popper, the Scottsdale deal is happening. You should invest, sis, this one's real." I finished my client call. I set my phone face down on my desk. Then I opened a new note on my laptop and typed the time. 10:47 a.m. I typed the date. I typed Marcus's exact text, punctuation and emoji included. I copied the thread to my personal email. I don't know why I did it. Force of habit, maybe. When something feels wrong, I document. It's the same reflex I use in depositions, in client meetings, in court. When the numbers don't add up, you write everything down before someone has time to rearrange the story. My father called at 2:15 that afternoon. He told me what he'd done. He said the runway line. He said he knew I understood. He said Marcus needed this and he knew I didn't need it the same way. I said, "I understand." I typed those words in my notes too, with the timestamp. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after Daniel went to bed, with the note open on my laptop and a cup of tea I'd made and forgotten to drink. I looked at the number. $1,200,000. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened a spreadsheet. Old habit. I started listing what I knew about money that had moved through my family over the years. Not accusations, just reconstruction. The way I would begin any forensic engagement. Start with what you know. Work outward from there. By midnight, I had a column I hadn't expected. My father died 9 months later, on December 19th, from a cardiac event that came fast and gave no warning. He was 71. He was at his kitchen table drinking coffee and reading about the Scottsdale project, which had, by then, begun to show the occupancy problems I had predicted. I will not describe the week that followed except to say that Daniel held my hand through most of it and I slept badly and I kept finding myself calculating things I didn't mean to calculate. The attorney's name was Patricia Holloway. She had handled my father's estate planning for 11 years. She called me on January 4th, 6 days after the new year, and asked if I could come to her office on the 9th for the reading. I asked if Marcus would be there. She said yes. I asked if there was anything I should bring. She paused briefly before she said no. I brought a folder anyway. I always bring a folder. Patricia's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the river that my father would have liked. She had a box of tissues on the table, the way attorneys do, and coffee in a carafe that nobody touched. Marcus was already there when I arrived. He was wearing a suit I hadn't seen before. He smiled at me across the table in the particular way he smiled when he felt he was about to receive good news, which was a smile that started with his eyes and worked outward, already a little celebratory, already ahead of itself. "Patricia, read the will." My father's estate, after the house and the small investment accounts and the personal property, amounted to approximately $340,000. Marcus looked briefly confused. Patricia explained the trust structure. My father had established a revocable living trust in 2019. The trust had been amended twice. The most recent amendment was dated February 28th of the year my father died, 7 days before the wire transfer to Marcus. The amendment removed Marcus as a residual beneficiary. The trust passed in full to me. Marcus said. "I'm sorry, what?" Patricia said. "The trust amendment is dated February 28th. Your father removed you as a beneficiary at that time." Marcus looked at me. "Did you know about this?" I said. "I'm hearing it the same time you are." Patricia said there was one more item. She produced a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. She said it had been included with the trust amendment when he delivered it to her office. She slid it across the table to me. I didn't open it in the room. I put it in my folder. On the drive home, I pulled into a parking garage 2 blocks from the office and sat in the car and opened the envelope. My father's handwriting was careful, the way it always was when he was writing something he'd thought about. The letter was 1 page. It began, "By the time you read this, you'll have found what I found. I'm sorry it took me this long to find it too." I read it 3 times. Then I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my folder. I drove home. Marcus called me 4 times between January 9th and January 14th. I let the calls go and responded by text. I said I was processing. I said the estate was still being evaluated. I said I would be in touch. On January 15th, he showed up at my house. Daniel let him in and then excused himself to his study with the quiet, deliberate tact of someone who understands that some conversations need to happen without witnesses. Marcus sat across from me in the living room. He was wearing the same suit. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been doing math they don't like. He said, "I need to understand what happened with Dad's estate." I said, "Patricia explained it." He said, "There has to be a mistake. He would not have cut me out. He called me 2 weeks before he died, Diane. He was excited about Scottsdale. He would not have." "He called me too," I said. Marcus paused. I said, "He called me the Sunday before the wire. He read me your pitch notes. He asked for my professional opinion." Marcus said, "And you told him not to do it." I told him what the numbers said. "So this is because of you." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Marcus, do you remember the promissory notes?" He looked at me. "Dad kept records," I said. "Do you remember signing them?" His face changed in a way I recognized. It was the face people make when they realize the conversation has been something other than what they thought it was. "Those were..." He stopped. "Those were just formalities." "That's an interesting word for a legal instrument," I said. He stood up. He said things I won't repeat here because they don't deserve the space. He said I had always been jealous, that I had always positioned myself as the responsible one to make him look bad, that Dad had loved him just as much and I had poisoned something. I sat with my hands folded in my lap. My voice stayed level. "This is not a virtue. It is a tool. I learned it in depositions. You don't give them the reaction they're looking for. You give them a quieter sentence." I said, "I didn't change any documents, Marcus. Dad did." He left. I called Patricia Holloway from the kitchen and told her to send the letters. If you've ever watched someone who couldn't find 30 minutes for a phone call suddenly have endless time when an inheritance is on the table, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. It gets quieter from here. Quieter is worse. I should tell you what I found in the spreadsheet I built that first night. My father had given Marcus money in 22 separate transactions over the course of 18 years. I found this partly through memory. I'd been present for some of it, heard about others in passing, and partly through the records my father kept, which I found in a filing cabinet in his home office when we cleared his house in late January. Raymond was meticulous. Whatever else, he was meticulous. The total of those 22 transactions, including the March wire, was $2,318,400. Of that total, $912,000 was documented as loans. Promissory notes signed by Marcus, with repayment schedules that were optimistic in the way that Marcus's projections were always optimistic and for the same reasons. None of them had been repaid. The promissory notes were legally enforceable. They were notarized. They had interest provisions. They were, in every meaningful sense, real. What my father's letter told me was this. He had found them himself in February, while reorganizing his files after a health scare we hadn't known about. A minor cardiac episode in January that he'd told no one about while he worked out how he felt about what he'd found. The letter said, "I spent 40 years confusing love with rescue. I don't think either of you ended up with what you deserved from that math. I'm trying to correct the ledger. I know that's a strange word, but you'll understand." He amended the trust on February 28th. He wired the money to Marcus on March 7th. I spent 2 weeks thinking about why he did it in that order, removed Marcus from the trust first, then wired the money. It took me a while to understand. He knew the wire was the last gift. He wanted Marcus to have it, and he wanted it to be a gift, not an inheritance withheld. He wanted to close the account himself on his own terms, knowing it was the final transaction. He was balancing the ledger in the only way he knew how, with the time he had left. He didn't know he had so little of it. The promissory notes, per the trust document, were an asset of the estate. The estate was mine. Patricia sent the letters on January 16th. Marcus called me from a blocked number on January 20th. I answered. He was not alone. I could hear my Aunt Carol in the background, which told me he'd been working the family circuit, building his case. He said there was going to be a dinner. He said the family needed to talk through the estate as a unit. He used that phrase. He said Aunt Carol's house, February 3rd, 7 o'clock, and that I needed to be there. I said I would be there. Daniel looked at me over the top of his reading glasses when I came back to the living room. I said, February 3rd. Aunt Carol's. He said, do you need me? I said, I need you to drive. I spent the 2 weeks between the call and the dinner the way I spend the 2 weeks before a major deposition. I reviewed every document. I organized the folder. I made copies of the copies. I read my father's letter 7 more times, not because I needed to understand it better, but because it was the last thing he ever said to me and I wasn't ready to stop reading it. On the morning of February 3rd, I made the copies I'd need and put them in a new folder with a rubber band around it. I put the original letter in a separate sealed envelope. I wore the blazer I wear to court. Aunt Carol's house smelled like garlic bread and the particular kind of tension that exists when 9 people know why they've been summoned and are pretending they don't. There were 9 people there. Marcus, Aunt Carol, 2 of my father's cousins, Marcus's ex-wife Elena, which surprised me until it didn't, 2 of Marcus's friends I'd met maybe 4 times, my cousin Jess, who looked like she wanted to be somewhere else and caught my eye when I walked in and gave me a look I filed away. There was wine I didn't touch and food I didn't eat and 20 minutes of performed warmth before Marcus stood up. He gave a speech. It was about my father, his generosity, his vision for the family, the way he'd always believed in keeping things together. It was genuinely well delivered. Marcus has always known how to hold a room. He said my father would not have wanted his legacy to be division. He said the trust amendment had clearly been made in a moment of confusion, possibly related to the cardiac issues that preceded his death. He knew a doctor, he said. He'd been looking into capacity challenges in elderly patients following cardiac episodes. He said the right thing, the family thing, was to honor the spirit of my father's wishes. To split the estate as it would have been split. To settle the promissory notes without involving courts. There was nodding around the table. Elena said, Raymond always talked about fairness. One of the cousins said, he wouldn't have wanted lawyers. Aunt Carol looked at me with the soft, expectant expression of someone who believes she is being kind. Marcus said, Diane, we're your family. What do you say? I asked for the floor. He gestured graciously. I set my folder on the table and opened it. I said, I want to share some documents with you, because I think it's important that everyone in this room is working from the same information. I slid the first page to the center of the table. It was a summary of the 22 transactions. Dates, amounts, recipients, classifications. I said, over 18 years Marcus received $2,318,400 from our father. $912,000 of that was documented as loans. Silence. I slid the second page. Copies of the promissory notes, front page of each. I said, these are the promissory notes. Notarized. Signed. With interest provisions. None of them have been repaid. Marcus said, those were formalities, I said. You mentioned that when you came to my house. I slid the third page. It was a copy of the trust amendment. Date, signature, notary seal. I said, the amendment was executed February 28th. My father was not in a state of cognitive impairment at that time. He had a regular check-in with his physician on March 2nd, 5 days later. His doctor has confirmed in writing that he presented no signs of impairment at that visit. I have that letter. I can provide copies. Aunt Carol said. Diane, nobody is saying. Marcus is saying it, I said without raising my voice. He mentioned capacity challenges. I want to be precise about what the record shows. I slid the fourth page. It was a printout of the wire confirmation from March 7th. $1,200,000. Timestamp 10:47 a.m. I said. This is the wire my father sent 7 days after amending the trust. He made this choice knowing what he'd done with the trust. These two decisions were not in conflict. They were the same decision. Marcus said. You cannot sit here and tell me Dad meant to leave me nothing. He left you $1.2 million, I said. 6 weeks before he died. That was for the development. The development, I said, has current occupancy at 31% against a projected 68%. That's from the property management report filed with the county assessor's office last month. Marcus, it is a public document. The room was very quiet. I reached into my folder and took out the sealed envelope. My father's handwriting on the front. I placed it on the table. I said, my father left a letter with Patricia Holloway when he amended the trust. I've read it many times. I'm going to read you one line from it. I opened the envelope. I found the line. I said, I spent 40 years confusing love with rescue. I don't think either of you ended up with what you deserved from that math. I put the letter back in the envelope. Jess, from the other side of the table, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Marcus said, this is not over. I said, the letters went out January 16th. You have 30 days to respond to the promissory note collections before we move to judgment. Patricia Holloway's information is on the letterhead. He stood up. The cousins looked at their plates. Elena looked at the wall. Aunt Carol looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not surprise. Something more like the face people make when a story they've been telling themselves for years develops an ending they didn't write. Picked up my folder. I buttoned my blazer. Marcus said, you're really going to do this to family? I stopped at the door. I said, Marcus, you've had family money your whole life. I'm just the one who figured out how to read the balance sheet. Daniel was in the car. The engine was already running. He handed me a coffee thermos he'd picked up while he waited. I sat in the passenger seat. I held the thermos with both hands. I didn't say anything for a while. Neither did he. We've been together long enough to know the difference between silence that needs filling and silence that needs keeping. After a few minutes he said, how'd it go? I said, I read everything 3 times. He pulled out of the parking space and we drove home. Patricia filed the collection actions on February 10th. Marcus contested them. He hired an attorney who, I will say, did credible work with thin material. The capacity argument went nowhere. My father's physician provided an affidavit that was unambiguous. The argument that the promissory notes were gifts with documentation was creative but not compelling. Signed, notarized, interest-bearing promissory notes with defined repayment schedules are not gifts. The total collected from the notes, including accrued interest, was $1,041,300. It took 14 months and a mediated settlement. Marcus paid a portion in cash and surrendered his interest in the Scottsdale development, which was by that point in default. The development sold at auction 8 months later for 41 cents on the dollar. The trust residue, the $340,000, passed to me in March of the year following my father's death, per the terms of the amendment. Aunt Carol stopped calling. The cousins were civil at an unrelated family event the following summer, the careful civil of people who have decided to have no opinion about something. Jess texted me in April. She said, I just want you to know I understood what you were doing in there. I don't know if that matters. I told her it did. We have had dinner twice since then. She orders the wine and I do not overthink it. Marcus and I have not spoken. The collection attorneys handled all communication. I don't know what he does now. I know the Scottsdale project is gone. I know he moved out of the Scottsdale property he'd been living in, which had been financed with my father's money. I know these things because they are part of the public record, and I know how to read a public record. The letter is in a frame on my home office wall. Just the one line. Daniel had it framed. He found the right frame, dark wood, simple glass, nothing ornate, and hung it himself on a Wednesday afternoon while I was on a call. I came into the office and saw it and stood there for a moment longer than I meant to. I spent 40 years confusing love with rescue. My father figured it out at the end. I think he had been trying to figure it out for longer than that, and he didn't have the language for it until he sat alone with his own filing cabinet and did the math himself. The resources from the estate, the trust distribution, the collected notes, went into a fund we established at the community college where Daniel teaches. It's called the Raymond Mercer Award for first-generation students. $2,000 a year, renewable, for students who are working and studying at the same time. Students who are, as my father might have said, landing the plane themselves. He would have liked that. I think he would have liked that very much. I think about him on Tuesdays, which is when he used to call. Here is what I've learned about the accounting of families. The ledger is always running whether you're looking at it or not. Love and money and expectation and sacrifice all have entries, even when no one is writing them down. The mistake is assuming that because no one said anything, nothing is owed. My father spent 40 years confusing love with rescue. I spent 37 years confusing capability with not needing. In the end, we both found the same document. We just found it from different sides of the ledger. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, that capability is not the same as consent, and patience is not the same as forgiveness, take that with you. Look at what you've been carrying and who handed it to you and whether they asked first. Update whatever needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.